Welcome to episode 36 of Posture Labs and Alignment Fundamentals. My name is Emma and I am your guide through this series. In each of these little posture labs or clinics, I'll be breaking down a different common yoga pose with different options, correct alignment, and tips and tricks. In this episode, we'll be covering bridge pose or Setu Bandhasana. I'll give you options for regular old bridge pose, bound bridge pose, and supported bridge pose with the block. So if you have a block, feel free to grab one, but it's not mandatory. You might also like a block for one of the drills I'm going to show you. And we'll start on our backs. If you've got a block, put that by your side. Let's go ahead and start with the knees bent, feet flat on the mat. So your arms are by your side, toes pointing forward. Here I like to make sure I can kind of brush my heels. There's probably going to be a natural arch in my lower back. So before I go into bridge pose, I actually want to tuck my pelvis and kind of remove that natural arch of my low back. So I'm thinking about pushing every single vertebrae of my lumbar and kind of even the thoracic spine down. So I almost feel like a little downward curve of my belly as I'm pushing and squeezing my transverse abdominals. So I have this almost tuck of my pelvis. I really want to try to keep that as I lift my hips up into bridge pose. Now most people are going to start with this arch back and then keep their back arched, and their chest is going to come up by their chin and they're going to feel pretty cramped here in their throat area. So instead, you're kind of lengthening your spine as you tuck your pelvis. You can almost think about the tailbone going forward and a little bit more scoop up. So now I feel less crunching towards my throat, towards my neck, more length in my spine. I'm actually feeling the work a lot more in my glutes and my hamstrings. Now let's take a moment to talk about the feet. A lot of people start with their toes out. I really want to make sure your toes point forward in bridge pose. Your heels will be the heaviest part of your foot, really driving down and even a little bit forward. As you drive your heel down and forward, there's a little bit of a push of your chest towards the back of your mat. But you're also pushing through the ball of your foot, not as much as your heel, I'd say, but trying to share the weight. So you're not like floating your toes in the ball of your foot off the mat and just driving your heels down. Maybe in the gym you do exercise like that where you just have your heels digging into the mat, but you're still going to keep your entire foot flat. I want you to feel really light in your toes. Like you could wiggle your toes around and you wouldn't compromise the pose. So you're not really gripping the mat with your toes. I like to place the block in between the thighs, the short width, just to give people an idea of how bridge pose should feel. So you're kind of squeezing the inner thighs together like they're magnets or like you're holding this block between your knees. Then lift your hips up. So you can feel the inner thighs and that tuck of the pelvis a lot more when you have the block. And then even when you do the pose without the block, just imagine that it's there. Or even maybe imagine a balloon is better because you want to squeeze the balloon, but you don't want to pop the balloon. So I'm not squeezing my inner thighs together so much, like I'm not doing an exercise at the gym. I'm not using a machine. The block is really just there to help me keep alignment. I'm not trying to like squish the block with my inner thighs. So that's one option for using the block. If you want to do bridge pose with a bind, same idea, tuck your pelvis, lift your hips up. You want to feel that scoop of your tailbone. Then you might wiggle your shoulder blades a little bit underneath you and bind your hands together. When you do that, you'll push the outside edges of your hands into the mat. A lot of people have they hyperextend their elbows, so they might lift their elbows up off the mat. Try to keep your elbows pushing down. Push your spine in a bit behind your heart and your chest towards the back of your mat. Keep imagining that block or balloon between your knees. And release. If that doesn't feel good with binding your hands, you can do something similar. You can lift your hips up, same idea, grab the outside edges of your mat. So that way, if you don't have the room in your shoulders to wiggle them together and bind, you can still kind of get that action of the bound bridge pose by pushing the outside of your triceps and your forearms into the mat. For supported bridge pose, you'll be using the block, but in a more restorative way. So I like to take the block on the low height so you have the most surfaced area, but if you need it to be a little bit higher, you could always double stack your blocks. Now from here, I'll lift my hips up like I'm gonna go to bridge pose, and then I'm gonna slide the block underneath. I like to rest the tailbone, kind of not the sitting bones necessarily, but the back of the hip bones on the block. Now, you might not feel a lot to start, but it should be relaxing. You can always walk your feet a little bit more forward and you'll feel more space and stretch through the tops of your legs. If you're like, this is definitely not enough for me, you can always add another block or adjust the height of the block. But again, I like to have a little bit more surface area so you don't feel like something's jamming into your tailbone. So for me, 2 blocks is a little bit too high. So I would recommend just doing 1. And if you need to, I guess turning it to the medium height. But generally when we do a restorative pose, we're gonna be here like 3 to 5 minutes. So even if you don't feel something right away, gradually as you stay, your body will kind of open up into the shape and you might end up feeling that gentle stretch. It's not gonna be as dramatic of a stretch as you would in like a forward fold or any other back bend. It should be pretty restorative. That's the point. As for if you have any like neck injuries or neck pain, I would, bridge pose should be pretty safe for you, but if you feel any pain, I would definitely recommend avoiding it. It's definitely not worth risking any re-injury. If you do feel pain when you do like shoulder stand, I will talk about that when we do that tutorial. So that's going to be completely separate, but I have some tips and tricks to kind of help you with that. If you have any other tips and tricks for bridge pose, let me know. Another thing I've seen people do is like take a resistance band around their thighs. But to me, we're not really working on pushing the knees out here like you might do in like a gym or maybe a Pilates class. We're not really working on pushing the knees out. We're actually working on squeezing the inner thighs. So to me, that kind of is the opposite of what we're trying to do, but it can help you, give you an idea of where you want to keep your knees, which is in line with your hips. Let me know if you have any questions about bridge pose or if there's other tips and tricks that you like and find helpful. Hopefully we'll see you back next week for our next tutorial.